Somewhere over the North Sea, in the thin grey light of a morning in the mid-1960s, a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft is climbing. The crew aboard the intruder believe they are safe. They are wrong. The pilot of the aircraft rising to meet them is a young RAF flight lieutenant strapped into a machine that should not, by any sensible reading of aeronautical engineering, behave the way it does. He has lit both reheats. The acceleration slams him back into his seat with a violence that makes the world narrow to a tunnel. Below him, the cloud deck falls away like a dropped curtain. The altimeter unwinds upward. 40,000 feet, 45, 50. Most fighters in the world would be wallowing by now, gasping in air too thin to breathe, controls turning to porridge. His is still climbing, as though the sky owes it a favor. 55,000, 60. And here is the thing the Russians never quite reckoned with. The thing that turned a generation of Soviet pilots into frustrated spectators. The English Electric Lightning did not so much fly to 60,000 feet as it lunged there. And then, when it felt like showing off, it kept going. There are RAF pilots, men still alive, who will tell you in a quiet pub voice that they Zoom climbed a Lightning past 88,000 feet and looked up at a sky that had gone black at noon, the curve of the earth bending away beneath them, and a U-2 spy plane, that supposedly untouchable American reconnaissance aircraft, sitting there, framed in the gun sight, utterly astonished. That intercept happened. It was logged. And the Americans, who had built the U-2 precisely because nothing could reach it, were not best pleased to learn that the British had a single-seat fighter that could rise up out of Lincolnshire and tap them on the shoulder at the edge of space. This is the story of an aeroplane that made no commercial sense, that drank fuel like a parched horse, that frightened its own ground crews, and that was, for one extraordinary and dangerous decade, quite possibly the finest pure interceptor on the planet. It is the story of how a bankrupt, post-war Britain, supposedly finished as a great power, conjured a machine that could outclimb the Cold War itself. But more than that, it is a story about fear, about the specific, clammy, 4-minute fear that haunted Whitehall and the Air Ministry through the 1950s and 60s. The fear that one morning the Soviet bombers would come, high and fast, carrying hydrogen weapons, and that nothing in the British arsenal would be able to climb fast enough to stop them before they reached the cities. The Lightning was Britain's answer to that fear. It was conceived not as an elegant solution, but as a desperate one. Strap a man to two of the most powerful engines available, point him at the sky, and pray he gets there in time. The men who flew it loved it and feared it in equal measure. The men who maintained it cursed it. And the men in the Kremlin who studied it understood, perhaps better than the politicians in London who were busy cancelling Britain's aviation future, exactly how dangerous it was. How did a nation that had just been told, in an infamous government document, that the era of the manned fighter was over, produce the most ferocious manned fighter of its age? Why could the Soviets, with all their resources, never quite catch it? And why, in the end, did Britain throw away the very lead it had bled to achieve? To understand that, we have to go back to a Britain shivering in the long shadow of victory. The Britain that built the Lightning was a country running on fumes and reputation. Victory in 1945 had been total, and it had been ruinous. The treasury was empty, the cities were scarred, rationing dragged on into the 1950s, and the empire that had once coloured a quarter of the globe pink was beginning, parcel by parcel, to slip from London's grasp. India had gone in 1947. The map was changing faster than Whitehall could redraw it. And yet Britain still believed, had to believe, that it sat at the top table. It had a permanent seat on the new United Nations Security Council. It was working, in deepest secrecy at Aldermaston, towards a bomb of its own, because Ernest Bevin, the bull-necked Foreign Secretary, had thumped the table and declared that Britain must have the atomic weapon whatever it costs, with a bloody Union Jack flying on top of it. The bomb came in 1952. The hydrogen bomb followed in 1957. Britain was determined to remain a power that mattered. But the strategic ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The wartime alliance with Moscow had curdled into something cold and dangerous. Churchill, out of office, had named it at Fulton, Missouri, in 1946. An iron curtain had descended across the continent. Berlin was blockaded in 1948 and saved only by an airlift in which RAF transports flew alongside the Americans. The Soviets tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of Western estimates. By the early 1950s, the question that kept the chiefs of staff awake was no longer whether war might come, but how it would arrive when it did. And the answer was terrifying in its simplicity. It would come from above. The Soviet Union was building long-range bombers, the Tupolev designs, lumbering at first but improving fast, capable of carrying nuclear weapons across the North Sea to British targets. Britain, a small, crowded island, presented a target that could not be dispersed and could not be missed. The aircraft factories, the dockyards, the cities, the V-bomber bases from which Britain's own deterrent would fly, all of it lay within a few minutes flying time of an enemy that had now joined the nuclear club. This was the nightmare that governed British air defence policy. The bolt from the blue, the bombers coming in high and fast, and the agonising mathematics of interception. To stop a bomber, you did not merely need a fighter that could match it. You needed a fighter that could be scrambled, climb tens of thousands of feet, accelerate to supersonic speed, find the target, and destroy it, all before the bomber reached the point at which it could release its weapon. The margins were measured in minutes. The consequences of failure were measured in hundreds of thousands of dead. The existing RAF fighters of the early 1950s, the Meteors, the Hunters, fine aeroplanes in their way, simply could not do it. They climbed too slowly. They topped out too low. Against a high-flying jet bomber, they were, in the cold arithmetic of the air staff, already obsolete before they had properly entered service. So, a requirement went out. It was numbered, in the bloodless language of Whitehall, Operational Requirement F.23/49. It asked British industry for something close to impossible: a supersonic interceptor of extraordinary climb and altitude performance, a machine to guard the skies of these islands against a threat that grew more credible by the month. At a company called English Electric, a quiet, brilliant, and famously stubborn designer named William Edward Willoughby Petter. Teddy Petter, to those who dared, had already begun to imagine exactly such a machine. It would become the Lightning. But first, it had to survive the politicians. Teddy Petter was not an easy man. He had left Westland after clashes over the direction of the company, arrived at English Electric, and there assembled a team of designers who would go on to do something the British aircraft industry had never quite managed before: build a genuinely supersonic fighter from scratch. English Electric had already proved itself with the Canberra, a jet bomber so good the Americans built it under license, a rare and telling reversal of the usual transatlantic traffic. Now, Petter and his successor, the gifted Frederick Page, turned to the interceptor. The design that emerged was radical to the point of eccentricity. Most fighters mounted their engines side by side. The Lightning stacked its two Rolls-Royce Avon engines one on top of the other, staggered, fed by a single nose intake with a distinctive shock cone in the center. This gave the aircraft a deep, narrow fuselage and a frankly enormous reserve of thrust for its size. The wings were swept back at a dramatic 60 degrees. The whole machine looked less like an aeroplane and more like a missile that had grown a cockpit as an afterthought. The experimental aircraft that tested these ideas, the English Electric P.1, first flew in August 1954 in the hands of Wing Commander Roland Beamont. B to all who knew him, a wartime Tempest ace, test pilot, and one of the finest aviators Britain ever produced. On an early flight, Beamont went supersonic without even using reheat, which startled everyone, including Beamont. The machine had performance to spare. The problem was never going to be the aeroplane. The problem was going to be the politics, because in 1957, while the Lightning was still being readied for service, a new Minister of Defence named Duncan Sandys produced a document that would become one of the most notorious in the history of British defence policy. The 1957 Defence White Paper argued with breathtaking confidence that the age of the manned fighter was effectively over. The future, Sandys declared, belonged to the guided missile. Manned interceptors would soon be obsolete. Britain need develop no more of them after the project already in hand. It was a catastrophe in waiting, and it would gut the British aircraft industry for a generation. But there was one saving grace buried in the wreckage. The Lightning was already too far advanced to cancel. It slipped through. By the narrowest of margins, the policy that killed the future of British fighter aviation spared the one aircraft that would prove the policy comprehensively wrong. Across the North Sea, the threat the Lightning was built to counter was evolving fast. The Soviets had fielded the MiG-21, a nimble and capable interceptor of their own. More worrying for the Air Staff and the Joint Intelligence Committee were the reconnaissance overflights. High, fast intruders probing the edges of British and NATO airspace, testing the defences, gathering electronic intelligence. And looming behind everything was the spectre of the high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and the high-flying bomber, the targets that lived up at 60,000 feet and above, in air so thin that conventional fighters could not follow. The men of RAF Fighter Command knew the numbers. They knew that an incoming raid would give them perhaps 4 minutes of useful warning once the radar chain picked it up. 4 minutes to scramble, to start two great engines, to roll, to climb, to kill. The Lightning was the only thing in the inventory that could do the sum in time. In 1960, it entered squadron service. The aircraft that politicians had nearly strangled in its cradle was now the sharp point of Britain's air defence. And the men who strapped into it were about to discover just how far up it could really go. The first squadron to receive the Lightning was number 74 Squadron, the Tigers, at RAF Coltishall in Norfolk in the summer of 1960. The pilots who converted onto the type came from Hunters and Javelins, solid aircraft, and nothing in their experience prepared them for what English Electric had built. The Lightning did not ease into the air. It leapt. Standard operating procedure on a practice scramble was to release the brakes, light both reheats, and hold on. The aircraft would unstick and then rotate into a climb angle so steep, better than 70 degrees, very nearly vertical, that pilots described the horizon simply dropping out of the windscreen and the world becoming sky. From a standing start, it could reach 36,000 feet in well under 3 minutes. It could be through the sound barrier in the climb. There was nothing else like it in NATO, and arguably nothing like it anywhere. But the truly remarkable performance, the secret that the Soviets could never quite counter, lived higher up. The Lightning's combination of two engines and that slim, missile-like airframe gave it a reserve of energy that allowed for what pilots called the zoom climb. You accelerated to supersonic speed in level flight, perhaps Mach 1.7 or thereabouts, and then you pulled up and traded all that speed for raw altitude, coasting upward like a stone thrown by a giant, far above the level at which the engines could sustain you. And it was here, in the rarefied dark above 60,000 feet, that the legend was made. In 1962, an RAF Lightning was vectored onto a U-2, the American reconnaissance aircraft built by Lockheed precisely because it flew so high that nothing was supposed to be able to reach it. The U-2 cruised at around 70,000 feet, serene in the belief that it lived above the threat. The Lightning zoom climbed, and an RAF pilot found himself looking at the U-2 from a firing position. The Americans were reportedly astonished. Their untouchable aircraft had just been touched by a British single-seater that had no business being up there at all. It was not a one-off. Lightning pilots, pushing their machines in the thin air, recorded zoom climbs to extraordinary heights. One celebrated flight reached a reported altitude in excess of 87,000 feet. Territory where the sky turns black, where the pressurized suit is all that stands between the pilot and a swift and ugly death, where the aerodynamic controls grow vague because there is barely enough air to bite on. Up there, the Lightning was operating at the very frontier of what a manned fighter could do. For the Soviets, this was a genuine and lasting problem. Their reconnaissance and bomber crews probing the approaches to the British Isles had to reckon with the fact that the RAF possessed an interceptor that could be on them in minutes and could follow them up into altitudes they had assumed were sanctuary. The 4-minute nightmare that had haunted Whitehall was, for the first time, answered by a credible 4-minute solution. But there was a serpent in this high-altitude Eden, and every Lightning pilot knew it intimately. The aircraft that climbed like nothing else on Earth was desperately, almost comically, short of fuel. Those two thirsty Avons in full reheat drank the tanks dry at a frightening rate. A Lightning scramble to high altitude might have only minutes of useful endurance before the warning lights began their grim sequence. The machine that could outclimb the entire Soviet Air Force could also, if a pilot lost track of his fuel state over the cold North Sea, simply run dry and fall out of the sky. The Lightning had reached for the heavens. Now it had to come home. And that, as the men of Fighter Command were learning, was where the real danger often lay. To understand what flying the Lightning on operations actually meant, picture a quick reaction alert hut on the Lincolnshire coast in the depths of the Cold War. It is the small hours. 2 Lightnings sit on the apron, armed, fueled, pointed at the runway, connected to ground power. Inside, 2 pilots in immersion suits doze in their flying kit, boots on. And then the klaxon goes. What follows is one of the most extraordinary feats of human and mechanical coordination of the period. The pilots are running before they are fully awake. Up the ladder, into the cockpit, ground crew strapping them in even as the engines spin up. The procedure is honed to the second, because seconds are the entire point. Within a couple of minutes of that klaxon sounding, 2 Lightnings can be unsticking from the runway and standing on their tails into the night sky, reheats roaring, vanishing upward. Out over the North Sea, a Soviet aircraft is approaching the UK air defence region. Often, it is a Tupolev, a great 4-engined reconnaissance and maritime patrol aircraft, what NATO nicknamed the Bear, with its distinctive contra-rotating propellers and its long probing range. The Bears flew the gap between Norway and the British Isles, down towards the Atlantic, shadowing NATO, photographing, listening, testing how fast the RAF would react and how far out it would meet them. The Lightning's job was to meet them well out, to shadow the shadowers, to make absolutely plain that the intruder had been seen, identified, and could have been destroyed. The intercept itself was a thing of cold precision. Ground radar vectored the fighter towards the target. The Lightning's own airborne radar, mounted in that distinctive nose cone, picked the intruder out of the dark. The pilot closed in, formated alongside the great Soviet machine, close enough to see the red star, close enough sometimes to see the faces of the Soviet crew looking back across a few yards of freezing air at the slim, predatory British fighter holding station off their wingtip. These encounters were, on the surface, almost courteous. There was a strange professional theatre to it. A wave, a photograph, a mutual acknowledgement between airmen of opposing systems that each was doing his job. But beneath the theatre lay live weapons and deadly intent. The Lightning carried cannon and air-to-air missiles. Had the order come, that escort would have become a kill in seconds. Both sides knew it. That was the entire message. And all the while, in the back of the British pilot's mind, ran the relentless arithmetic of fuel. Every minute of the intercept, every mile flown out over the grey water, had to be balanced against the fuel needed to get home and land, or to reach a tanker if one was available. The Lightning gave you supremacy at the price of constant, gnawing anxiety about the gauges. Pilots learn to fly the aeroplane with one part of their brain permanently devoted to the question that could kill them. Have I left myself enough to get back? The aircraft demanded everything of the men who flew it. It was fast, brutal, exhilarating, and utterly unforgiving of carelessness. To master it was to join a small brotherhood of pilots who had flown one of the most demanding machines the RAF ever fielded, and who, for a brief and dangerous span of years, held the high ground over the North Sea against the largest air force on Earth. But supremacy in the Cold War was never measured in dogfights alone. It was measured in budgets, in white papers, in the cold ledgers of a treasury that had never quite forgiven the aircraft industry its expense. The Lightning ruled the skies. It could not rule the accountants, and the cost of all this magnificence was about to come due. Let us begin with the human cost, because it was real and it was paid in full. The Lightning was a superb interceptor and a genuinely dangerous aircraft to operate. Of the roughly 330 built, a substantial number were lost in accidents over the type's service life. A loss rate that, in today's terms, would be regarded as appalling, but which the Cold War accepted as the price of fielding so extreme a machine. The cause is read like a catalogue of the aircraft's own ferocity. Fires, above all. The Lightning had a persistent reputation for engine bay fires, the warning lights that every pilot dreaded, the awful uncertainty of whether the fire was real or the sensor was lying. There were undercarriage failures, control problems, and always the fuel. Aircraft ran dry. Pilots flamed out over the sea and faced the appalling choice of ejecting into the freezing North Sea or trying to coax a powerless fighter back to a runway it could not reach. Some made it, some did not. The names are recorded in squadron histories and remembered by the men who served alongside them. There is one story that has passed into legend and is true. In 1966, a Lightning at the Hatfield Aerodrome took off entirely by accident with a ground engineer named Walter Taffy Holden, a man with no jet experience whatsoever, in the cockpit having intended only to run up the engines. He found himself airborne in one of the fastest aircraft in the world, with no canopy, no flying helmet, and no real idea how to land it. That he brought it down alive, after several attempts, tells you something about both the man and the machine. That it could happen at all tells you something about the Lightning's terrifying, hair-trigger eagerness to fly. But the deeper cost was strategic, and it was self-inflicted. The 1957 Sandys White Paper had declared the manned fighter obsolete, and although the Lightning survived, the philosophy behind that document poisoned the well for everything that should have come after it. Britain had, in the Lightning, demonstrated a world-beating capability in supersonic interceptor design. The logical successor, a more advanced, longer-ranged, better-armed British fighter to follow it, was strangled by the same treasury-driven, missile-obsessed thinking that had so nearly killed the Lightning itself. The pattern repeated across British aviation with grim consistency. Project after promising project was cancelled, most infamously the TSR-2, the Advanced Strike Aircraft scrapped in 1965 by Harold Wilson's government in a decision that broke hearts across the industry and saw tooling deliberately destroyed so the program could never be revived. The men who had built the Canberra and the Lightning, who had genuinely led the world, watched their successors cancelled around them. Britain increasingly found itself buying American or collaborating with European partners rather than building its own. The lesson Whitehall drew, and it was a bitter one, was about the limits of British power in the missile and nuclear age. A medium-sized nation, however brilliant its engineers, could no longer afford to do everything alone. The costs of frontier aviation had outrun the resources of a country still paying down the debts of 2 world wars. The Lightning was, in a sense, the last of a kind. The last all-British supersonic fighter, conceived and built entirely at home, owing nothing to anyone. What Britain learned, then, was double-edged. It learned that it could still produce, when it tried, a machine the equal of anything the superpowers fielded. And it learned, almost in the same breath, that it could no longer afford to keep doing so. That contradiction, world-class capability shackled to declining means, would define British defence policy for the rest of the century. The Lightning soldiered on regardless. But the world it had been built to fight in was already changing around it. The Lightning's frontline career in RAF service was remarkably long for so extreme a machine. It guarded British skies from 1960 until 1988, nearly 3 decades, during which the geometry of the Cold War shifted repeatedly beneath it. It was upgraded, re-engined, fitted with larger fuel tanks bolted to its belly in an attempt to address its one great weakness, and pressed into service well beyond the point at which its designers had imagined it retiring. For much of that time, it was the backbone of the United Kingdom's air defence, working hand in glove with the radar chain, the V-bomber deterrent force, and later the Phantoms that Britain bought from the Americans. The Lightning and the Phantom served alongside one another, and the comparison was telling. The Phantom was a fine, versatile, 2-man aircraft that could do many things competently. The Lightning could do one thing: climb and intercept. Better than almost anything in the world, but it could not match the Phantom's range, its weapons load, or its flexibility. The future, everyone could see, belonged to the multi-role aircraft. The pure interceptor, magnificent as it was a specialist in an age that increasingly demanded all-rounders. The Lightning also became one of Britain's more successful defence exports, which mattered enormously to a balance of payments forever under strain. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait bought the type, and the Saudi deal in particular kept British aerospace workers employed and laid groundwork for the vast Anglo-Saudi defence relationship that would later run through the tornado and beyond. In the cold ledger of Cold War economics, an aircraft that could be sold abroad helped pay for the defence of the realm at home. The Lightning earned its keep in more ways than one. Strategically, the aircraft's long service spanned the most dangerous decades of the confrontation with the Soviet Union: the Cuban crisis, the building of the Berlin Wall, the great Soviet military expansion of the 1970s, the renewed tension of the early 1980s when a new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington against what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire. Throughout all of it, the Lightning sat at quick reaction alert, and Soviet bears flying the gap towards the Atlantic continued to be met, shadowed, and escorted by the slim British fighters that could climb faster than anything Moscow could send. The special relationship with the United States ran through all of this. The U-2 intercept of 1962 had been a moment of friendly one-upmanship, the British reminding the Americans that they were not the only ones who could touch the edge of space. But the deeper truth was that Britain and America were partners in the air defense of the West, sharing intelligence, sharing the burden, sharing, through the radar networks and the early warning systems, the same agonizing 4-minute mathematics. The Lightning was Britain's contribution to a collective defense that no single nation could mount alone. By the mid-1980s, though, time had caught up with it. The airframes were old, the maintenance burden enormous, the design philosophy belonging to another era. The Tornado F-3 was coming to take its place in the air defense role. And so, in 1988, the RAF retired the Lightning. At last, its final flights flown amid a great deal of emotion from the men who had loved it. It went out as it had served, fast, loud, and utterly distinctive, leaving behind a generation of pilots who would tell anyone who would listen that they had flown the most exciting aeroplane the RAF ever operated. But its true legacy was about something larger than nostalgia. It was about what Britain had been, what Britain had become, and the uncomfortable distance between the two. So what, in the end, does the Lightning tell us about Britain and its place in the world? It tells us, first, that the post-war decline of British power was never a story of lost capability. The engineers at English Electric, the test pilots like Roland Beamont, the squadrons that mastered the most demanding interceptor of the age, they were the equal of anyone, anywhere. When Britain set its mind to building a world-beating machine, it built one. The Lightning was not the product of a nation that had forgotten how to be great. It was the product of a nation that still very much knew how. But it tells us just as clearly that capability is not the same as power. Power, in the second half of the 20th century, was a matter of resources, of sustained investment, of the sheer industrial and financial mass to keep doing the difficult thing year after year. And that was the test Britain could no longer pass alone. The same country that produced the Lightning cancelled the TSR-2, gutted its aircraft industry on the strength of a flawed white paper, and increasingly bought its hardware from America or built it jointly with Europe. The Lightning was the last all-British supersonic fighter precisely because the conditions that produced it, that particular blend of brilliance, ambition, and just enough money, never came again. There is something almost tragic in that, and something instructive. The Lightning stood guard over the British Isles for nearly 30 years, the sharp answer to the deepest fear of the nuclear age. It could outclimb the U-2. It could humble the Soviet reconnaissance crews who thought 60,000 feet was sanctuary. For a brief, exhilarating span, a single-seat fighter rising out of the flat fields of Lincolnshire could touch the edge of space and frighten the superpowers. And then the budgets closed in. The world changed, and Britain quietly accepted that the age of doing everything itself was over. The men who flew it understood, I think, that they were flying not just an aircraft, but an argument. An argument about what their country could still achieve, made in aluminium and reheat and raw climb performance, 10 miles above the cold North Sea. That the argument was eventually lost to the accountants does not make it any less true. For one decade, Britain built the best, and the Soviets simply could not catch it. That is the Lightning's real legacy, a reminder that greatness and means do not always travel together, and that a nation can be brilliant and constrained at the very same time. Now, I'd genuinely like to hear what you think. Was the Lightning the finest interceptor Britain ever built? Or was it a magnificent dead end, all climb and no endurance, a symbol of a country reaching higher than it could afford to stay? And was the decision to stop building our own fighters a clear-eyed acceptance of reality, or one of the great strategic blunders of post-war Britain? Tell me in the comments, especially if you served on the type or knew someone who did. Those stories are the ones worth preserving. If you enjoyed this, do hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the aircraft, the operations, and the hard decisions that shaped Britain's Cold War. There's a great deal more of this story still to tell, and I'd be glad of your company telling it.